So, hello everybody, thank you for, this is not in Polish, I apologize. Thank you everybody for coming out to the Krakow Photo Festival Day of Lectures here. My name is Brad Feuerhelm. I'm, I guess, a writer, collector of images, a curator. I do several things for within photography. Without any real specificity. But I'm here today to talk with, and I'm going to mispronounce his name, so you'll have to excuse me. Michał Siarek.
It's actually quite funny because there's another photographer with pretty much the same name, so watch out.
I apologize for this. We're here today to talk about his book and his project called Alexander, which it's really a complex book. There are a lot of socio-political layers to it. There are a lot of mythological layers to it. Certainly a lot of historical references to the project. It's a project, I shouldn't paraphrase for him, but I should say, in my words, it's a project somewhere between the facade of the materialism of history in the way that it works into tribalism, economics, and identity in the contemporary age, based completely in Macedonia, in former Yugoslavia. And Michał kind of, it's a strange project in so much that we had a discussion about it earlier, and there were sort of layers and layers and layers that kept unfolding from my initial presumptions about the work. And so in effect, there's much more gravitas, it's much more heavy, if you will. There's so many layers involved in it. There's also humor in it, but you wouldn't see it right away. But the main purpose of the book is really, from a layman's perspective, is to kind of look at nation states, to kind of look at Macedonia, its geopolitical positioning, and how its representation through architecture, through art, and also very much through the claiming of historical reference through Alexander the Great. Which is disputed by some territories and states such as Greece. So the very base question that I'd like to start with, because I find your background quite interesting as well, is how did you become involved with this? How did you focus on this? I know things have changed greatly in the past 6 days. We'll talk about that later. But how did you become involved with this as a Polish artist, photojournalist, photographer?
Hey, thank you very much. So, well, at first I had no idea about the complexity of what is happening in Skopje. So I went there in roughly 2010, thinking, describing myself as a photojournalist primarily. And I hoped for some easy come, easy go, helicopter approach, pictures of a country that I had no idea about. I mean, I couldn't research enough because I was not skilled enough to find the clue. And after the initial trip, when I lost my first camera and I couldn't fucking note, then I found out that basically what is happening is a huge crisis of identity. I found this out already in a bus when a guy named Goran told me that well, there's no doubt about whether he is a Macedonian or not, because he was born in the Republic of Macedonia and no one can take this away from him. So yeah, that was the first access point. And still I had no idea about, I knew about some conflicts, but then again I was not prepared to carry out the story that I in the end found. So that was back in 2010, I was about 20, 21 maybe. And I came back home with the idea that there is something running in this country. And I went there just because a couple of weeks before, months before, I went to Kosovo to photograph the anniversary of, next anniversary of separation from Serbia. So that was just a next step. I was very much into Balkan conflicts and the complexity of what is happening in the Balkan Peninsula. But on the other hand, on the lack of coverage in the international media or the misinterpretation of or misunderstanding. So yeah, I went there first 8 years ago, and 3 years after I went again, and what I saw was the monument of Alexander the Great, which is roughly 24 meters tall. And to photograph it, I to some extent made the stupidest thing in my life back then. But in the end, I found a story that was not directly connected to me or my state or my background, but was in a way interwoven in my all my interests at the intersection of everything that was important to me back then. By which I mean in between in the political in the nexus of politics, science, history, and culture, at the topic that was too difficult to comprehend in a single publication that I couldn't find that could explain what is really happening in Macedonia in one single sentence. So it took me 8 years to form this sentence that is on the back side of the book. And in a way I became obsessed with Alexander the Great, in the same way as many nations all across the globe are fascinated by this figure.
And yet, with this fascination of Alexander the Great, the sort of separate or subtext of what you're actually covering in the book, Alexander the Great is kind of, I don't know what the term would be for it, but it's kind of this thing that, it's this image you put out there of something which is the easiest representation of something else, in the sense that this is the pinpoint of an image that actually talks more about historical referencing, more about global politics. It has everything to do with the name of Alexander, but has nothing to do with the name of Alexander at the same time. It's just one of these sort of lame, in a way, a lame duck thing. It's a populist view of of a topic in a nation. We're talking about the monument of Alexander that's been made in Skopje. We're talking about why or why not he's Macedonian, if you're Greek, for example. But those, yeah, I gotta be careful there. But if you think about these things and what they're hiding from the populist. So, for example, before we discuss who Alexander was, we have to understand, historically, we have to understand that in present tense, those discussions, those name values about nationhood, about nationalism, about identity, and Macedonia in particular is having its own identity now as a country, what the geopolitical situation is when we talk about the name Alexander, from admittance to the EU and from NATO inclusion. Could you talk a little bit about how difficult that actually is?
Okay, so one of my first drives was to understand the comprehension of this topic and the complexity of it, which boiled down to the fact that I couldn't find a single essay that could explain it. And before I found someone who was capable of doing the project with me, by which I mean explaining this complexity or the meanings of it, all the context, to a general audience, I found out that I'm the only journalist who is interested in the topic, and I spent a couple of years just on research to ensure that, well, I couldn't believe that I'm the only one who is interested in this country. But before we go further, we got the paper here that is exactly the answer to the lack of this essay.
So we're going to hand out a newspaper here, which deals directly, or if you'd like to have one, it's for your leisure. So we're expecting you all to read that right now, and then when you're done reading, we'll get back to you with the interview.
One of the very first confusions that we had, and by we I mean all the authors who are behind Alexander, as that's not as one-man show. Well, most of the authors are my co-authors are my fixers who devoted their private time and didn't expect any pay, because they were equally involved or obsessed with the story to explain it to a general public or general audience who may not be so much into, technically prepared or scientifically prepared to analyze what happened exactly in the Republic of Macedonia. So we found that it is sort of important to address the public with the simple version of it, that is easy digestible, not overly scientific. So that's the paper that is accompanying the exhibition in Warsaw. If you are staying longer, please visit us at Instytut Fotografii Fort in Warsaw. Though the main complexity that you may need to understand is, please open the map, find the map, that's on the 3rd or 4th page. There are more than, there's more than one concept of Macedonia. Historically, you may heard about the empire of Alexander the Great, the greatest conqueror who conquered nearly the entire back then known world. And the problem is that this toponym comes from a very particular concept that is being applied presently to political conditions. So many people, for political reasons or for other reasons, try to connect themselves or relate themselves with the myth of Alexander the Great, who is also supposed to be the ancestor of Heracles from mythology. So if you look at the map, you may see the dotted area, which is the Vardar Macedonia, Pyrenean Macedonia and Aegean Macedonia. It's all in 3 different countries. And there's a little bit that is also called Macedonia in Serbia and in Albania. So when it comes to terms of what Macedonia is, we are already confused. And same were the politicians who back in 40s established, probably same were the politicians who back in 40s established the state named after one of these geographical regions. So back in 40s, the strongest military power in the Balkans, the guerrilla fighters led by Marshal Josip Broz Tito. They held enough power to seize most of the peninsula, and that was Marshall's will to establish the country that was supposed to be called the Socialist Republic of Macedonia. And that was the very first time that Macedonia was established after 2,500 years after the collapse of Alexander the Great and after his death. So, not to explain too much what exactly happened in between, just to say that this concept is stretched for over 2.5 millennia, and Alexander was mentioned both in the Bible and in the Quran. So from this perspective, that's quite a significant figure to be associated with. And how far should I go with the history?
Keep going.
Okay. So the state that was established in the 40s got 3 most important things for a nationhood. So they got the area that was being protected by a common army, the language that is a Slavic language that is pretty much similar to Bulgarian and Serbian and Croatian and all the Slavic languages, same to Polish, and the church. Because what is the most confusing part about the Balkans is that till, at least mid-20th century, people in the Balkans were not, of course this is a shortcut, but they were not associating themselves with, applying themselves with the common understanding of what national identity is. So in those terms, within the same family, you could have a mother that describes herself as Greek, father who was Serb, child who was Bulgarian, and in the end that's a huge mess, and depends who asks the question, the answer may vary. So the problem was that most of the people in the area described themselves in between ethnical factors and religious factors, and typical national identity did not apply to this area till early 20th century. After 6 centuries of Ottoman Empire that ruled over this area, it was all intermixed and interwoven, which also affected the religious structure. But this is not a topic that we should tackle now because it's way too deep. There are some mosques that are built in the same building, in the same structure as Orthodox churches, and people visit both at once. So this is sort of complex, and their coexistence is a very interesting topic, but not for now. So after the dissolution of, back to Yugoslavia first, and within the Yugoslav period, this area was by acclamation forced to developed a new identity that was supposed to ease all the tension between all the national groups, so between Serbs and Croatians and Macedonians and Greeks and so on and so on, I mean within the Yugoslav Federation. So to say that potholes in Croatian roads were fixed with the money coming from Serbia, just to ease the tension and just to make people coexist peacefully. But in the end, that was supposed to create a common identity of Yugoslavs, of Southern Slavs, who are having the common history, common language, pretty much similar, and who share the common identity and interest. And it was supposed to be a sort of political utopia that was working pretty well until the 90s, when the Yugoslav Federation fell apart. And coming back to Macedonian issue, Macedonians got everything at Tito's time, by which I mean they got language, they got country, they got church that was independent from Serbian or Greek church or Bulgarian church. So that was sort of a formative factor for this nation. And we are still speaking about 40s. So when the Yugoslavia collapsed in the 90s, there was a huge void in the country, because suddenly they split from the former from the federation, from the Yugoslav Federation, without any single shot being fired, so quite peacefully compared to all the rest of the peninsula. But they immediately fell into a deep conflict with Greeks, who claimed that there's just one Macedonian, there's just one Alexander, and it belongs to Greeks. So that was sort of a conundrum that was difficult to solve to people who were born and raised as Macedonians, whatever it means. So in those terms it became highly political, and back in the 90s that was not a big issue. They just had this, they had to replace the official name that was the Republic of Macedonia to the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia, this silly acronym, and that was the only internationally recognized symbol. There was also a flag issue that we don't have to go that deep, and everything seems to be quite so to say cool, because even the president of the republic said that Macedonians are Slavs, so basically they came to Balkans in 6th century, and they have no claims towards antiquity. But back in 2006 or 2005, the conflict with Greeks reignited, as Greeks blocked their application to NATO and blocked their application to start negotiation with European Union, which caused a huge backlash back in Macedonia. Back then, the former president of Macedonia said that Macedonia want to be part of the international community, but not at any price. And the price was the name, which is still a conflict that is lasting for last 28 years. And what Brad just told is that the conflict is about to be resolved, and most of the major changes happened within the last 7 days. So we published the book 2 weeks ago, and that's exactly the breaking point. So that's pretty much important to me. What happened afterwards was the huge program that was supposed to reconnect Macedonians with their supposed identity, by which politicians in Skopje meant that that Macedonians are direct ancestors of Alexander, meaning of Heracles and so on, and it ignited a huge architectural scheme that was supposed to transform the town into a replica of what they believe is an European town with deep roots. So I suppose we'll go deeper into that, but
there's certainly questions I have. I mean, that's just part of the layers of what Michał is working with. That's just part of it. And as he sort of mentioned about not having the larger discussion about religion, especially in that particular area, is quite interesting, because it doesn't actually factor into the book, but could be like 100 books by itself. So getting sort of back within the sort of idea of the sort of identity politics, or getting back into the idea of how mythology shapes, or how the idea of objects or ideas shape a nationhood. There's there's a thing I sent along to Michał about another person working in the arts, and I don't generally cross-reference artists working, but they've both come across me in the past year. And obviously Alexander is one of them. Another one is by a Belgian photographer named Thomas Nolf, who did a book about Bosnia-Herzegovina and the pyramid that's there. And it's this idea that, if for those of you who are unaware of the sort of conspiratorial pyramid in Bosnia, there's a big landmass in Bosnia that there's one particular archaeologist, I say that in quotes loosely, that claims that it's a pyramid, and is doing excavations there, and there's these stone spheres there, and he's claiming it is some sort of spiritual, mythological, national treasure to be unearthed. And it struck me as odd because there's this, not to delve too much into that work, but it's in the same territory, roughly, is Michał's work, which I find interesting, this idea that we're so in the 21st century, that we're so desperate, in particular in Europe, to come up with borders, to redesign borders, to re-engineer a mythology. So with Alexander, this question about changing the name, or whether or not Alexander was from Macedonia or Greece, and having that actually block, for better or worse, NATO intervention in your society, or EU membership, for better or worse, is a hugely fascinating parallel that I was unaware of with Macedonia. But I think this is sort of not only identity politics, but it is also the sort of seizure of Western capitalism on former communist and former Yugoslavian states, which is another huge layer of the onion that's being unwrapped, I think, in the Alexander book. And I wanted to know, you speak a little bit about communism as it relates to architecture in the book. You're talking about how some of the facades of the old buildings, if they aren't congruent to the new sort of application process to the EU, if they're communist, they're erased. Which is kind of interesting because you have this parallel of the last 50 years trying to be erased from the architectural spectrum. And then you have, from 2,000 years ago, you have the rebuilding of monumental structures to Alexander, which seems incongruent and very strange to be pulling so hard from the past for nationhood, for identity, for nationalism even, and then also at the same time reducing the everyday, the quotidian, and the banal facade of your architecture to get rid of the last 50 years of history. So I'm just wondering about your thoughts about how the sort of the two sides of working between the sort of Western hegemony and capitalism on the site. I'll call this site, not a state, because we're talking about Skopje, the capital, and not necessarily all of Macedonia, and how that works out with the trajectory between this Alexander question, which is just one of the few topics that you're covering. So if you could talk a bit about how the cityscape is changing, how we talked about the Disneyfication of architecture, how we talk about plasterwork, how we talk about facades, how we talk about things that are left hollow, like columns. If you could talk a little bit about that and the money that's happening there at the same time.
Okay, so at first I think we should get back to 2006 to get this point straight. So imagine that there's a state in which there's a huge disappointment all across the society, and suddenly there's a guy who says, oh, come on, we are going to stand back, we are going to stand back from our knees, and we are the timeless nation who gave the legitimacy to all the Europe because Alexander was ours. So sort of that was the most dangerous card that could be played back in 2006 by Prime Minister Nikola Gruevski, who I think he was slightly inspired by one of the archaeologists that we were going to mention later on. And he had this idea that was not consulted widely with the population to build these mock-ups all across the town, all across Skopje, which is the very peculiar town if you think in a wider perspective, because Skopje was raised by earthquakes 3 times over past over 15 centuries. The original settlement, Roman settlement, was razed by one earthquake. Then the rebuilt capital was also razed, and in the modern town of Skopje was also struck by a disastrous earthquake, which destroyed over 80% of the town and killed 200,000 people in 1963. So, as the aftermath of this disaster, the international community ran with help, which was supposed to rebuild the capital as the most modern town in the Balkans ever. The plan for redevelopment of Skopje was proposed and awarded to Japanese architect Kenzo Tange, who was also responsible for reconstruction of Hiroshima. And I think we could get back to this picture. Yeah, kind of important. And this is the scheme that was found. I found it at the fortress that was built after the first earthquake. So you may see this silly blimp here, and those this sort of tower. Well, at least 1/3 of those buildings were actually erected, and it has nothing to do with the former architecture of Skopje, although it transformed Skopje into the most modern town in the Balkans. However, the modernist architecture, the brutalist or socialist architecture, was supposed to be aseptic when it comes to nationalhood, nationhood, and so on. And apparently, in the huge void that came after the collapse of Yugoslavia, when people were again regaining their history, their identity, they were rethinking what was supposed to be. I think this is not clear. Well, back in the Yugoslav period, there was a huge drive to make everything common, like typically communist past that was supposed to be common to all the nations all across the Balkans. So after the 90s, all these people had to negotiate again what belongs to whom, and which history belongs to a particular nation. So in this huge void of recognition, of understanding each other, in Macedonia was in the kind of a difficult position, because they were not really established. The national identity was not really established. It was more Yugoslav than anything else, and apparently this disappeared. This has disappeared. So there was a huge need to fill this gap, and it took roughly 20 years when Prime Minister Nikola Gruevski came with this idea to cover all this up, all these buildings which you have here, which are the original constructions, with columns and facades, so it will look more antique, so it will be more convincing that they are ancestors of Alexander the Great. And among these buildings, well, some of them were converted, some of them were built from the scraps, and within the ratio of, so to say, 1 square kilometer, maybe 2, they tarnished 200 to 300 monuments within 2 years. Altogether, the project that costed 750 millions of euro was supposed to build up the identity, and we were coming to a quotation that I suppose you would like to.
Yeah, I think I don't know maybe you want to do it. Can you do it in Polish, or is it possible? I mean, I don't know if it's necessary, but I read this in the PDF when I received it. I just thought it was such a heavy to everybody.
Okej, jesteś nowy w tym miejscu. Wszyscy inni ludzie mają swoje korzenie w rodzaju bogów albo królów, ale ty pochodzisz od komarów, od zakarpackich komarów. Później mówisz temu samemu dziecku: zobacz, byłeś niepiśmienny, dopóki święci bracia Cyryl i Metody dali ci pismo w IX wieku. W tym czasie wszyscy inni mieli już swój skrypt, czyli swój alfabet. Jeśli wychowujesz kogoś w ten sposób, on przez swoje doświadczenie życiowe będzie czuł się gorszy od wszystkich innych z zewnątrz, od każdego obcokrajowca, ponieważ podczas swoich formatywnych lat edukacji było mu powtarzane, że wszyscy obcokrajowcy są lepsi od niego i że w ogóle wszyscy są lepsi od niego, ponieważ on jest tylko tym, kim jest. Bo nie mają korzeni, bo nie pochodzą od niczego. This is the part of official documentary that was supposed to explain why the project is necessary, why they need to invest this amount of money. But then again, we got this propaganda, which we should. Where is it? It's not anywhere here. Yeah. So it's slightly different. So let's read it in English. In particular, to all of you who are wary of the socialist realist grayness and concrete expanses designed to separate us from beauty and the corrupting influence of decadent aesthetics, which were counter to the morals of communism. To you who have lived for 30 years without seeing a single new building erected in the city center, and to you born in independent Macedonia with no understanding of why your country has been forbidden to remember and have its own history, the time has come. The time has come to take hold of what belongs to us, what our ancestors worked for, but what was squandered instead of building parks, streets and monuments dedicated to foreigners. It's about time that people witness a government that create and leave something behind, and so on and so on. Yeah, that was one of the most unconvincing sentences without the whole documentary. That was intended as explanation why Skopje should be again in the quite short history of the town rebuilt from the scraps. So where should we go now?
I was just thinking.
Because I could talk about Skopje for ages, but
well, that's what we're doing. So, but that also has to do with that idea of ornament as crime, you know. But then again, bringing back that was the brutalist side of it. But bringing Mies van der Rohe and bringing back the sort of classical, condition, let's say, and using it to prop up this national glory as seen through the cityscape and through architecture is it's quite fascinating. Where I will lead this next is oftentimes photography uses text in a strange way. One, you can use photography to prop up a story in a newspaper, and the other way to do it is to use texts from a story to prop up photography. And that's something more, I guess, of the artistic inclination that gets played with, to use text as an element to prop up or to make better or to make more relevant or understood a photograph. And that's what's happening here. If you have a chance to see the book, I suggest you do so, because there's a certain use of text that talks about the officials of Skopje, it talks about corruption, and it talks about the sort of current state of, I guess, politics in the sort of former Yugoslavian territories. You use the text very successfully. The text is based on is the official prime minister and is another member of parliament. It is. Who are the two? Who are these? Prime minister and minister of transport.
Explain what it is. I mean,
the communication.
Of the book.
I'm getting to that. So that's the question. Is if you could enlighten us on the use of text in the book as it works out to the photographs in particular, because as we spoke about earlier, there's a certain push and pull between the two.
Well, at first I was quite confused how to carry out the story, not to be judgmental or juxtaposing the problem, because I had no idea if I should take any stand or not, and that was an issue that was running for me for good couple of years. I had to become sort of an expert with historical knowledge to argue with all those, romantics, often historians, often quasi archaeologists who wanted to argue whether they are or they aren't this or that. So I was looking for something less judgmental, and in the aesthetic terms, I was searching for something that could be something that would, the aesthetic approach that could give you the bigger picture, so you can judge by yourself. So I didn't have to explain what's the difference between what is genuine in Skopje and what is artificial, what was built up and what is a remain of actual town. So coming from this concept, I thought that eventually maybe I don't have to explain everything, although I don't like pictures that are being supposed to be self-explanatory. I think it doesn't work this way. So I try to execute the story in as much aseptic way as I could, while interweaving some clues in between. And we need to jump forward to 2015, when the huge crisis broke out in Skopje, by which I mean the publication or the release of wiretapped conversation between leading politicians in Skopje, which you will find as those pages in the book. Because this gave me the clue that eventually I don't have to explain everything. Those are as I said, the conversation between Prime Minister and all of his ministers from the cabinet for past 5 years. And it was a sort of a soap opera of people who don't believe even a bit in what they are doing, but they are burning a pile of money, they manipulate elections, and no one really knows whether it's truth or is it manipulated for any other political purposes. So at first I decided to include those materials as a context to the images. For instance, when we see the boat that is supposed to be genuine, but it's just a second. Yeah, so we got the boat, and the boat was supposed to be a restaurant. And many people, when they see this picture, they think, oh wow, then the Varda River must be quite deep, and this must be a genuine boat. No, it's not. That's one of 3 boats that is made of concrete because some sick mind had the idea that they need to look a bit like an Amsterdam to make more European, and that was among the things that were on the tapes, that this is necessary for an European town to have a ship. So in the tape that is before the image, Prime Minister explains to his minister how 14-story garage should look like to be Baroque, how to make it convincing, and also how to present it to the parliament so no one will notice that this is a scam. And this is the lightweight material, because further on they discuss how to check the ballots, who voted and who didn't, and how to deliver the message on the media that they want. And in the end, the final tape that sparked the riots in Skopje that caused a revolution back in 2015 and 16 was the attempt to cover up the murder that happened after a political rally, when the security of Prime Minister has killed a young boy, like I think he was 21 years, Martin Neszkowski, and they tried to cover it up really badly. Otherwise, that would be pretty much a mess. And what summarizes the concept of those tapes and those material side stories that are commenting much more than I could comment the whole process can be summarized in the words of the Minister of Internal Affairs. As long as those little people are voting, keeping their mouths shut, everything else I tell you is less important. And that was said on the record. Turned out that the Prime Minister has orchestrated the surveillance not just of the citizens, but also of his of his colleagues and other members of the parliament, to keep the tight control over the population. In the end, that sparked a riot that affected in huge changes in Skopje. I mean, superficial changes, but we will get back to this. But coming back to the structure of the story, the first layer are, of course, images that can be, for some are convincing, for some are not. Macedonians who published these pictures in one of the newspapers think that they described it that I'm very fond of what is happening in Skopje, and that I feel like an Indiana Jones discovering the story. That's what was printed. But I try to keep this as much, so to say, objective, or without imposing my perspective to show you the maybe all the way around. I use photography to look at all those objects and people who are behind the project from different angles. from materials to concepts, from using scale of the objects to play with it and to imply some sort of twists that could be guiding you through the book. And then the last layer are the news messages, the outtakes from the newspapers that are sometimes, quite often, very contrasting to what officials said about it publicly or what was the original intention. So not to spoil what happened afterwards, the book was supposed to be a research book instead of Encyclopedia of Macedonia. So you can read it on at least 3 to 4 layers, and Alexander was just an excuse to have a deeper look at how the national state was built there in this particular case.
I have questions for you. Do you actually think you're impartial? One word, yes or no?
Yes.
How do you feel that you're impartial as somebody who does editorial of this value? I'm not calling you anything. I'm asking you questions, and I'm being a bit of a devil's advocate here, because when I look at the book, I actually see you as impartial, not impartial. I see you for the better, but I see you as somebody who has a very heavy opinion throughout the book, whether it's, I don't see this necessarily as, we talked about this role between artist, photographer, and photojournalist, photographer, and it's an age-old question, but intention, especially through editorial, is very important, and you're criticizing the state. In my opinion, you are criticizing the state, I should say it like that, because of what you choose to show, not because of what you believe necessarily, but how you've woven your story together, how you use the news lines, even the way you talk about it here in the presentation. I'm just being a bit of a devil's advocate. You don't have to hate me yet. You can wait. But the point being is I don't understand, I don't really feel that you can be impartial with this sort of heavy material when you choose through editorial, not in a newspaper or a public way by self-publishing a book. You're showing you're not impartial to me. That's one question, and I'll leave it there. The next we're going to talk a little bit about iconoclasm. He's writing on his paper, "Fuck you."
Well, as I said, I'm not the only author, and among few of my co-authors who spent with me years in Macedonia, we tried our best to balance and to provide as much context from both sides as we could to regain the sort of objectivity that wouldn't leave the work imbalanced. By which I mean, for instance, there is not a single word coming from the opposition, which could be, in my perspective, it is seen as could be seen as misdeed, but that wouldn't be right, as I'm using heavy materials on the ruling party, and also it questions whether the intentions of the opposition are correct and if their actions are legit, because what you can read afterwards is that there's not a single proof that all those tapes are genuine, and there's no way that you can prove that. And Prime Minister Gruevski played, again, he's a very smart politician, the best card he could. I think someone helped him with that. Although he said that, well, come on, at least half of those stories are right, but the real question is, who gave it to them? So he played along, and he polarized the society again. And that is pretty much my intention, not to judge any of those sides. I'm not interested in judging whether the conflict should be resolved this or that way, because Macedonians, whenever they see those pictures, see whatever the hell they want. The opposition with which I'm now in contact, since the power was passed to the former opposition, would like to use those pictures for their political purposes, which is also quite peculiar. And I feel quite uncomfortable with that, because it plays along their strategy. But then again, my personal intention was to understand it, and I'm not willing to give any juxtaposing opinions on that. That's not my case. I'm giving you all the materials that I had, slightly edited because, well, for instance, I had to get rid of the conversation with the spirit of Alexander the Great conveyed through a spiritual medium, because that's slightly over the top and it wouldn't be within the context of the story. Though still, we spent quite a lot of time in balancing the content and woven the content between captions and news from the local media and so on, to make it as much neutral as we could. Although I think that you are pretty much packed with your own context, and you see whatever the hell you want to see in this, and that was my thing, to go all the way from the materials to people who came up with this idea, to figure out why, and I used photography, and then I combined it with text to roll it, to see it from a variety of perspectives and eventually direct it. But that's the only thing. There was no intention in imposing any opinions on that.
There's a thank you. There's a two-part question that has to do with both archaeology but also iconoclasm. The first bit is, you worked with an archaeologist who seems like quite a character. He looks, he's in the book. He looks quite fascinating, actually.
Oh yes, he is.
And I'm very interested in the role that we have with cultural debris in archaeology, and the way that it plays into, this goes back a little bit to an earlier conversation, but the way that it plays into the building of nationhoods, in particular, how fragments, how the sort of different pieces that we pull from the earth are actually meant to recalibrate and re-mythologize a contemporary society, going back to the Bosnian pyramids thing, and how if we dig in the dirt long enough, we can find an excuse for whatever we think we are. And the second part of that is going along with artifacts, going along with archaeology. After we speak about the archaeologists you work with, I'm interested in the idea of how iconoclasm happens in public monuments, from Gustave Courbet during the Paris Commune of 1871 in the Vendôme column, how it was torn down, whether or not he did or did not actually have anything to do with that or not, but how we take these public objects that are also now in the future, they become archaeological objects, how those pieces from the earth and from what we tear down from iconoclasm are used in a political sense to represent the now. And I think I'd like to know where the big statue of Alexander is going to go, and also that if you could illuminate us again on being given access to these monuments that they're hiding from the public, that have been torn down or brought. You said there's a group of monuments that are in a room, which is an interesting idea. So if we could talk about archaeologists, and then
let me just write it down. So if I may ask you, if you could form this question in one sentence, or it's not possible? Not absolutely not possible. Okay. So first Pasco. So and then
this archaeologist?
Yeah. And then taking down the monuments.
I can do that next if you want.
Okay, I will just note it. Okay, so this is Professor Pasco Kuzman, extraordinarily vivid figure. To wrap it as a joke, Skopje has a brilliant gypsy minority with own theater and music groups and so on. And one of the rap groups has this song that goes, "If you want to know what's the time, ask Pasco Kuzman." Because Pasco Kuzman wears 4 watches, because he believes that time is passing different around him, that he believes in multiple dimensions and so on, because he's a really romantic guy. So Pasco Kuzman is an archaeologist who was also the advisor to Prime Minister Gruevski back in 2005 or 6, who, well, he made the first push because he recommended after the conflict with Greece in terms of this associating with NATO, to put the genuine monuments from Greek or Roman period in front of the parliament, so to say, modernist parliament. So it was in sort of contrast, which brought a lot of criticism. And Kuzman is he's an accomplished archaeologist with a huge backstory and very romantic appeal, because he found an ancient burial mask back in his hometown Ohrid, which is the town in the south, the town back from the Roman period, quite important in the Via Egnatia, the road stretching from Istanbul to Rome. And well, Kuzman is the most romantic person I met there, and I sort of felt that everything clicked when I met him. Well, Kuzman was sentenced for trafficking artifacts when he tried to distance himself from the government doing all these crazy constructions. He tries not to be associated with them closely, and everyone told me that Kuzman was imprisoned. So I was looking for him for, well, so to say, half a year, maybe a year. And in the end, I tried to go to the National Museum where his office was supposed to be, and we met at the stairs, although he was supposed to be imprisoned. So he invited me to his office called the Troy, because of the everlasting search for the ancient town. And we began the interview. I mean, at first I just wanted to take a picture. He was kind of nervous, and well, he had no idea why am I even interested in that. And most interviewers tried to make fun of him because of these stories about watches and time travels and so on. But we were quite prepared with Marek, with my fixer, to conduct an interview. So first I shot the pictures, then we started an interview, and it turned out that was the game changer for me, because he seemed to be quite a reasonable guy who understands what is the meaning and what is the function of this architecture. Although he clearly stated that they went slightly, they were hauled over the keel with this project, that it shouldn't be so scaled up. But being with Kuzman, touching, I would call it like a living history, something very substantial, that we are discussing the Alexander who was dead, who died 2.5 millennia, and we are still in the room that is filled with artifacts, and it's sort of a wet dream of all filmmakers. And he's quite cool about it, and he explains how come that the grave and the body of Alexander was never found, that was lost in, well, not to give the dates, but that was lost, and there are multiple tribes all around the world that would like to associate themselves with him. So meeting him, well, that was the first big change. And then he was my access point to all the rest of the people who were behind the Skoki 2014 project and all this political mess. Because without his phone call, I wouldn't meet Valentina Stefanowska, who was the author of the main monument. And that is a whole new story, which we
apparently apolitical. Yes.
Yeah, I think we should get back to Valentina and how it happened that. Yeah. So for me, that was the most romantic part, because from the very beginning of this story, that was also a very romantic story for me. I was growing up with this myth and obsession of Alexander. We had a jeep, we had a huge tripod. All the project was shot on 4x5 inch. So sort of, yeah, we were dived into deep into the history and sort of, yeah, this Indiana Jones appeal. Try to find our way to the understanding of who Alexander really was, who Alexander really is to those people. And so coming from Pasco,
let's move to the artist before we destroy the artist. Let's move to the sculptress.
One more thing that I haven't told you in the conversation before. So the most peculiar aspect about this whole national identity and the grand planner behind the project, which supposedly for many people was this guy, but he was not. There was a very peculiar case in Greece in 80s when same guy, looking pretty much similar, also crazy archaeologist who writes poetry and so on, called Manolis Andronikos, found something that was supposed to be the grave of Philip II, father to Alexander the Great. And till the 80s, Greeks had no claims towards Alexander the Great nor the ancient Macedonia. But then they found the grave, and there was a huge show made by Andronikos, to cut the story short, to include Alexander into their national construction. So this is quite parallel. There's this mastermind that played along and lost interest at some point and got fired. And speaking about Valentina,
it's only because I want to ask you what the monument will. The artist who crafted the monument, Valentina, and her last name you'll have to address again, crafted the monument of Alexander under the vocal sort of opinion that she was somewhat apolitical about what she was doing, which in reality, if you're sculpting the monument of Alexander,
that's the monument,
which is massive.
That's the dummy for the monument.
Yeah.
And that's the author.
And that's the author. Valentina Stefanovska, who says she's fairly apolitical about building this, creating this massive Alexander statue. You know, she was asked to do it, so she did her job. We've heard this before. But I'm not suggesting there's a parallel. However, I'm interested about the build-up of this and this idea that one can be apolitical when telling a story or making a body of work, and whether or not the destruction of it, what the status is rather about the monument.
Well, so we need a fast forward into the newest resolutions. So after the tapes were released in 2015 and 16. That has engulfed country in chaos on the verge of a civil war, not to go too deep into that, which caused a change in power that was also peaceful. That was surprised. We were quite surprised because we were at some point prepared for a civil war, and the new government, in order to normalize the relations with Greece and to normalize the city center, decided to do, guess what? To take down all of the monuments in the longer span, and the contract to do that was pretty much awarded to given to the same company who at the first place built them for, as I said, 750 million euros. The company is called Macedon Beton, which is also quite silly. And the future of those monuments is quite uncertain at the moment, because this is like way beyond my scope as a photographer, because my intention was to capture the some piece of this story and try to make it as universal as I could. But then again, what happened in last couple months well, turned it upside down, because the new government already took down two of the monuments, and because they are very fond of what I did, they granted me the access to the deposit where they keep the monuments that are being taken down, and the access to places where they will keep all the monuments that are supposed to be taken down within next months. So there's this silly story that is, I think, the most entertaining when it comes to me, is that the Archaeological Museum of Skopje, which is on this picture, holds a copy of so-called sarcophagus of Alexander the Great, which is a copy. And it's not even Alexander's sarcophagus, but they bought it because it seems like a crowning, like a cherry on the top. And from what I know, in next month they need to demolish it, because all of the museums are under the investigation whether this is historically legit or not. So yeah, that's sort of another chapter of erasing the past on the whole new level. Although the optic has changed, the issue whether Alexander was Greek or Macedonian or what is the conflict about is pretty much the same, because we are still discussing about polarizing the society and making a huge smoke cover or smoke screen to keep people busy and divided. Again, in words of Gordana Jankulowska, former Minister of Internal Affairs, as long as those little people are voting, everything else, I tell you, is less important. So what is happening now in Skopje is very peculiar to me, and it seems that, well, the plan is serious. They are going to take it down. Plus, 6 days ago, Prime Minister Gruevski was imprisoned in one of the trials that were being in which he is persecuted. So everything is going down now.
I do suggest with that, there's, as I mentioned, there are sincere layers to this book. There's a lot of political, economic, mythological, cultural issues to sort of dissect. I think it's a fantastic book. I think the work is fantastic. I've never been to Macedonia. I have no idea about it, but I find it fascinating. But at this point, what I think would be pertinent is if we turn it over to some questions. And if you are interested in the questions in either Polish or English, we're more than happy to accommodate that. Sorry, are there any comments? Are there any comments? That's the way I'm supposed to ask, I think. Does anybody have any questions, comments, rebuttals, territorial disputes?
Yeah, especially territorial disputes. If there's anyone who is interested in Macedonian history and wants to argue, because at the opening of the exhibition there was a 70 years old journalist who came just to argue with me.
But you're fun to argue with.
Yeah.
He must have heard.
I was very fond of it.
Any questions or comments, guys? Here is the book. It's just been published. If you get a chance, please have a look. It's much more in-depth once you get a chance to, I mean, I feel our conversation was in-depth, but if you get a chance in particular, look at it, read the text, sort of associate yourself with the idea, or not, it's up to you, but it's quite fantastic. And thank you all for coming. One sec.
Besides all those overly packed with stories and informations, pictures, there are also some nice pictures with animals and landscapes. So
there's some beautiful pictures as well.
Yeah, I knew. Like this is the main issues with the main issues.
The composition, the color palette. Like.
Screw you. Yeah, but what I was going to say, what I was supposed to say is that the main problem with project of so many layers of complexity is not to overload people, and I see that you're already that tired with us talking. And this is exactly the idea for the book, not to make it digestible in one attempt. So there are 3 to 4 layers, and just and Easter eggs that are hidden within the book, like for instance the font and other things that I'm not going to describe. So yeah, it's a playbook for nationalists, and well, sorry for that, but I think sort of this is a guidebook, and that was intended as the whole topic was intended as a manual to have a look impartially, because I wouldn't be able to have a look at my own state from this perspective, and I was given the chance to grow up with a very complex issue that was highly underreported for the nation that still is neglected and not really misunderstood. So I think I used my chance, and one of the problems, and that's why you have the paper, was how to reach the regular people who don't give a fuck about books and art and photography, and how to make them well, at least question what the identity is, and why is it for, why do we need it, and what's the use. Yeah, I think that's a wrap. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Unless we have some questions.
Is there any questions informally? We can set the microphone down if it helps.
Yeah, what happens to your life now? It's been 7 years, so what happens next?
Which life? Which life? I had no life. I dedicated 7 years of work just to be there all the time, to work, to finance it, because I find it quite important to be independent within such stories. And well, I'm not going to complain, but till now, and it has been 7 years, no Polish media was ever interested in this story. So I find it sort of silly.
How come on, just one?
Just one. Yeah, there's one podcast that it was interested, that is going to be released quite soon.
You definitely know this person in the audience.
Yeah, that's a scheme.
Okay, thank you guys. Appreciate it. Thank you.